The first scream tore through the blood moon feast just as Alara reached beneath the folds of her silver gown to touch the tiny parchment hidden against her heart, the one carrying the words she had rehearsed all evening to tell her husband that after 3 barren years, after 3 winters of whispered pity and cruel glances from noble women who counted her empty cradle more faithfully than they counted their own sins, she was finally carrying his child. Seraphine Voss collapsed beside the long banquet table before Alara could take a single step toward Kale, her jeweled goblet striking the marble with a sharp crack as dark red liquid spilled across the floor like fresh blood. Within seconds, half the great hall was on its feet, chairs scraping, guards rushing forward, voices crashing into one another, and Seraphine was clutching her throat while crimson foam stained the corner of her lips. Alara froze beneath the enormous black banners of House Draven, one hand instinctively covering the life beneath her ribs while every eye in the hall slowly turned toward her. Lord Garrick Voss moved first, not with the panic of a father terrified for his daughter, but with the terrifying precision of a man who had waited for this moment. He dropped beside Seraphine, shouted for the royal physician, then lifted his head toward Alara, with fury already prepared in his eyes. "Search the Luna's chambers," he commanded before Kale had even spoken, and that single order made something cold slide down Alara's spine. Kale should have stopped him. He should have demanded proof, should have reminded the hall that no one searched the private rooms of the Luna without the Alpha King's consent, but instead he stood beside the throne with his jaw locked, watching Seraphine gasp theatrically in her father's arms. Alara looked at him, waiting for the smallest sign of the man who had once sworn beneath the moonstone altar that no accusation would ever stand between them. He gave her none. By the time the guards returned, carrying a narrow black vial wrapped in one of Alara's handkerchiefs, the hall had already decided what it wanted to believe. The physician uncorked the vial, smelled it, and went pale. "Nightbane extract," he said, and a murmur of horror rippled through the nobles. Garrick rose slowly, his face twisted into righteous outrage. "Found in the Luna's own chamber," he announced, making certain every corner of the hall heard him. Seraphine, pale but conveniently conscious now, lifted trembling eyes toward Kael and whispered that perhaps Alara had done it because she feared being replaced. The words were soft, but they struck harder than a shouted accusation, because the court already knew the fracture that had been growing between Kael and his wife. 3 years without an heir had become a public wound, and Seraphine had spent months pressing her fingers into it. Alara felt the folded pregnancy note beneath her gown, warm against her skin, and nearly laughed at the cruelty of it. They were calling her barren while her child lived inside her. They were calling her jealous, while the man she loved stood in silence beside the woman who wanted her place. "I want an independent investigation," Alara said at last, keeping her voice steady even as the first cramp twisted low in her abdomen. "Search every servant, every cup, every hand that touched Seraphine's table. Search the Voss quarters, too." Garrick's expression hardened instantly, and several elders exchanged uneasy glances, but Seraphine gave a wounded little breath as though Alara had struck her. "You would accuse my family while I am still bleeding?" she whispered. Then she turned toward Kael, and whatever fear she had pretended before vanished beneath something far more dangerous. "If you trust me, my king, prove it." The hall fell silent. Alara understood at once what Seraphine was doing. This had never been merely about poison. It was about forcing Kael to choose in public, where pride would be louder than love. Alara looked at her husband and said, "If you take her into our chamber tonight, if you reward this accusation before the truth is known, there will be nothing left for me to return to." Kael's eyes met hers, and for one heartbeat Alara saw hesitation. She saw the man who had once carried her through snow after she collapsed beside a battlefield infirmary. The man who had slept on the floor beside her bed during a fever because she was afraid to wake alone. But then Garrick spoke from behind Seraphine. "Blackmoor cannot be ruled by sentiment." Several elders nodded. Kael's shoulders stiffened. Pride replaced doubt. "Then perhaps," he said, each word slow and deliberate, "you should not return." The silence afterward was so complete that Alara heard her own heartbeat, Seraphine's mouth curved by the smallest fraction. Kael descended the steps of the throne and stopped before Alara. The moonstone clasp that marked her as Luna rested above her heart, fastened to the ceremonial mantle she had worn beside him for 3 years. Kael reached for it. Alara did not move. His fingers closed around the silver wolf emblem, and with one hard pull he tore it free. A gasp swept through the hall when the clasp snapped loose, taking a strip of fabric with it. Alara's skin burned where the metal had scraped her collarbone, but the humiliation cut deeper. Kale turned and placed the moonstone clasp into Seraphine's waiting hand. That should have been enough. It was not. Seraphine stepped closer, draped the Luna mantle over her own shoulders, then looked Alara up and down with open triumph. "A Luna kneels when the Alpha King passes judgment," she said. Alara stared at her. "Then become one first." The insult landed cleanly. Seraphine's face tightened, and Garrick immediately called it defiance against the crown. 2 guards seized Alara's arms. She resisted on instinct, and one twisted her wrist so violently that pain shot to her elbow. The cramp in her belly sharpened. Her breath caught. For one terrifying second she thought of blood, of the child she had not yet told Kale existed, and fear nearly broke through the mask she had forced onto her face. Kale saw her flinch. Alara knew he did. His gaze dropped toward the hand she pressed against her abdomen, then returned to her face, but he did not ask if she was hurt. He did not order the guards to release her. Instead, he told them to take her back to her rooms until the investigation was complete. Seraphine then walked beside him toward the royal corridor wearing Alara's mantle, and every noble in the hall understood where Kale intended to spend the night. Alara watched them leave together beneath the carved stone archway that led to the private royal chambers, the same rooms where Kale had once promised her that nothing in Blackmoor would ever come before their bond. She felt something inside her go strangely quiet. Not shattered, not yet. Something worse. Something had withdrawn. She slipped the marriage ring from her finger before the guards even reached the stairwell and closed it in her palm so tightly that the edge cut into her skin. Later, alone in the abandoned eastern room assigned to her, Alara set the ring on a wooden table and finally pulled the folded parchment from beneath her gown. The physician's words were still written there in clean black ink. Nearly 8 weeks. Strong pulse. No complications. She read them once, then again, until the letters blurred. Down the corridor, faint through stone and distance, she heard laughter from the royal wing. Seraphine's laughter. Alara turned away before grief could make her weak. There was one thing left in the room that had belonged to her mother. An old cedar box Alara had never been allowed to open while Lysandra lived. The key had been sewn into the lining of her childhood cloak. Tonight, with her marriage ring lying abandoned behind her, Alara broke the wax seal and lifted the lid. Inside rested half of a silver crest shaped like a crowned wolf, a letter, and a narrow strip of blue silk bearing the royal seal of Silvercrest. Her mother's handwriting shook across the page. Alara read the first lines with numb disbelief, then sat down because her knees could no longer hold her. Lysandra had not been the healer's widow Alara had always believed her to be. She had been Queen Lysandra of Silvercrest, wife to King Aldrich, and Alara had been hidden as an infant because powerful men wanted control of the northern throne. The letter did not explain everything, but one command was unmistakable. If Blackmoor ever turned against her, if she was ever stripped of protection and believed herself alone, she was to send the half-crest north. "Your father will know," Lysandra had written. "He has never stopped waiting." Alara pressed the letter to her mouth while tears finally burned free, not for Kale, not even for the humiliation, but for the possibility that the emptiness she had carried all her life might have been built on a lie. Before midnight, she summoned Rowan's youngest courier, a quiet stable boy who owed Alara his sister's life after a winter fever. She wrapped the silver crest in blue cloth and placed it into his hands. "Ride north," she told him. "Do not stop at any Blackmoor post. Give this only to King Aldrich." The boy disappeared through an old servant tunnel beneath the western wall, while, far above them, torches still burned in Kale's chamber. Alara stood alone in the cold corridor, one hand over her unborn child, unaware that Seraphine had already sent a physician to prepare a draft that would make sure no heir ever came between her and the throne. Hours later, beyond the northern ridge, the courier reached a military camp where 10,000 silver banners surrounded a black pavilion. King Aldrich opened the bundle, saw the broken crest, and went completely still. Then the old king rose so violently his chair struck the ground behind him. "Wake the army," he ordered. "We ride for Blackmoor. Bring me my daughter." By sunrise, Seraphine was already walking through Blackmoor, as though the palace had belonged to her for years. She wore Alara's silver Luna mantle over a deep crimson gown, the moonstone clasp gleaming above her heart like a stolen victory, and every servant who saw her lowered their eyes quickly enough to hide their disgust. Garrick walked beside his daughter with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed the most dangerous part of the plan had already succeeded. "The king must sign the decree today," he told her quietly. "Humiliation is not enough. Ilara must lose the title permanently before she can gather sympathy. Seraphine glanced toward the eastern tower, where Ilara had been confined, and smiled without warmth. She will not have time to gather anything. Garrick's eyes hardened at that answer, but he did not ask what she meant. In House Voss, cruelty was rarely questioned when it served ambition. KL, however, had slept less than an hour. He stood alone in the royal chamber while dawn bled through the narrow windows, staring at the empty side of the bed where Ilara had slept for 3 years. Seraphine had finally fallen asleep near the hearth sometime before dawn, but Kale had never touched her after entering the room. The performance before the court had been enough to destroy what remained of his marriage. He had discovered too late that winning a public argument did not feel like victory. When he returned to Ilara's former room, he found her wedding ring lying on the table beside a folded gown. He picked it up and felt a pressure close around his chest. Inside the gown's pocket, his fingers brushed a small parchment bearing the seal of the royal physician. KL pulled it halfway free, but before he could unfold it, Seraphine's voice sounded behind him. "The council is waiting." He slipped the paper back without reading it, and that single unfinished movement would haunt him long after the truth came out. The council chamber erupted before KL had even taken his seat. Garrick demanded Ilara's permanent removal, insisting that Blackmoor could not survive with Aluna accused of attempted murder. Several nobles agreed, especially those who had spent years whispering that Ilara's failure to produce an heir was a sign that the moon goddess had rejected her. KL listened in silence until one elder asked whether there had been any independent examination of the poison. Garrick immediately answered that the evidence was already sufficient. KL noticed the speed of the reply. For the first time since the feast, suspicion moved through him, quiet but persistent. "No decree today," he said. Seraphine's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Garrick leaned forward. "Your Majesty, delay makes weakness visible." Kale stared at him. "Then let them see weakness until I see proof." It should have been the beginning of Kale correcting his mistake. Instead, his pride dragged him halfway back into it. Rather than release Ilara, he ordered her confined to the eastern tower, and forbade her from leaving Blackmoor until the investigation was complete. He told himself it was caution, that allowing her to disappear after the poison accusation would make the kingdom appear unstable. In truth, another part of him could not bear the idea that Ilara might simply walk away. So he chose control where trust had already failed. When the order reached Ilara, she read it once and folded it neatly. She did not rage. She did not demand an audience. That silence unsettled the guards more than shouting would have. Ilara had understood something Kale had not. A marriage could survive anger, but indifference was often the first sign that love had begun turning into something colder. By noon, the first physician arrived at the tower carrying a pale blue draught. He introduced it as a tonic meant to calm Ilara's nerves after the shock of the feast. Ilara took the cup, lifted it toward her lips, and stopped. There was a bitter metallic scent under the lavender, faint but unmistakable. Her mother had taught her enough about herbs to recognize moonroot when boiled too long. In small doses, it eased pain. Concentrated, it forced the womb into violent contractions. Ilara lowered the cup. "Who ordered this?" The physician's eyes shifted toward the door. "The palace." That answer told her everything. She smiled faintly and pretended to drink, letting the liquid disappear into the folds of a cloth beneath the table while the physician looked away. The moment he left, Ilara poured the remaining draught into a sealed vial and hid it beneath a loose stone near the window. Seraphine visited less than an hour later. She entered without permission, closed the door behind her, and stood in front of Ilara, wearing the stolen moonstone clasp. "You always had a talent for making people pity you," she said. "Even now, half the servants look at me as though I stole something sacred." Ilara's eyes dropped to the clasp. "You did." Seraphine's jaw tightened. "Titles belong to those strong enough to keep them." Ilara said nothing. That silence angered Seraphine more than any insult. She stepped closer and looked deliberately toward Ilara's stomach. "Some things are more fragile than titles." Ilara's pulse changed. Seraphine smiled when she noticed. "There, that is the first honest expression I've seen from you all day." Ilara's hand moved instinctively over the life inside her. Seraphine's voice lowered. "A dead heir cannot reclaim a throne." For the first time, Ilara's control cracked. She rose so quickly the chair scraped behind her. "If you touch my child," Seraphine laughed softly. "So it is true." The realization struck Ilara immediately. Seraphine had suspected, but she had not known. Ilara had confirmed it. Seraphine stepped backward with triumph brightening her face. How unfortunate KL never heard the news. Alara's eyes hardened. You should be afraid of the day he does. Seraphine's smile thinned. No, you should be afraid of whether the child survives long enough for him to care. She left before Alara could answer, and the door locked behind her with a sound that felt like a sentence. Elsewhere in the palace, Mara had already begun risking her life. She returned to the banquet hall under the excuse of helping clean the remaining stains from the Blood Moon feast, then searched the servants' passage where the poisoned goblet had been prepared. Beneath a broken crate, she found wax fragments bearing the crest of House Voss. Later, inside the evidence chamber, she examined the black vial taken from Alara's room and discovered the same seal pressed faintly into its base. Mara wrapped the fragments in cloth and hid them beneath her sleeve. She almost reached the eastern tower. 2 Voss guards stepped from an archway before she could turn the corner. By evening, Mara had vanished. Ilara demanded to know where she was. The tower guards claimed ignorance. When Ilara sent a message to Kale asking for a formal search, Seraphine reached the council chamber first. She is inventing witnesses now, she said, her voice carefully wounded. How long will you let her manipulate you? Kale looked toward the parchment bearing Alara's request. Mara has served her for years. Exactly, Seraphine replied. A perfect accomplice. Kale should have ordered the search immediately. Instead, he instructed the guards only to look into it. It was a weak command, vague enough to be delayed, and Garrick made certain it was. That night, Maelor came to the tower in secret. He was old enough that few people watched him closely anymore, which made him more dangerous than they realized. When Alara showed him the half-crest her mother had left, his face drained of color. Where did you get this? He whispered. Alara told him. Maelor sat down slowly. I saw this seal once, 22 years ago, in the northern court. Ilara's breath caught. Then my mother was telling the truth. Maelor looked at her with something deeper than surprise. If your mother was Lysandra Silvercrest, then this is not merely a family relic. This is half of the royal succession seal. Ilara stared at him. Maelor continued carefully. And if the other half still exists, then someone in Silvercrest can prove exactly who you are. Alara asked the question she had feared since childhood. If my father was alive, why did he never come? Maelor's face tightened. That is the question someone has spent 20 years making sure you could not answer. Before he could explain further, footsteps sounded outside. Maelor slipped away through a servant passage, leaving Alara alone with a truth that made the tower walls feel smaller. Her entire life had been built on absences. A dead mother, an unknown father, a kingdom that treated her as rootless. Now every absence seemed deliberate. At the same hour, a rider arrived at Garrick's private quarters carrying news from the northern watchtower. Silvercrest banners had been seen crossing the ridge in force. Garrick dismissed the messenger and locked the door. Seraphine stood near the fire, no longer smiling. How many? She asked. Enough. Garrick poured wine with a hand that was almost steady. Seraphine stared at him. Why are you afraid of them? He said nothing. She stepped closer. What is Alara to Silvercrest? Garrick turned so suddenly that the wine spilled over his fingers. Do not ask questions you are not prepared to survive the answers to. Seraphine's face went cold. You knew who she was. Garrick looked toward the window. I knew who she might be. He lowered his voice. And if she lives until sunrise, everything we have built ends with her. Before midnight, Garrick placed a sealed accusation before Kale. Alara had secretly contacted Silvercrest, sent royal property beyond the border, and attempted to invite a foreign army into Blackmoor. The evidence was thin, but the timing made it dangerous. Kale read the charge twice. You want me to call my wife a traitor because she sent one messenger? Garrick replied. I want you to prevent a war before it begins. Kale's gaze lingered on the blank space beneath the arrest order. He knew something was wrong. He knew the poison investigation was incomplete. He knew Mara had disappeared. Yet fear of appearing weak before the council pressed against the same wound Seraphine had been feeding for months. Kale signed. Minutes later, Iron Boots climbed the eastern tower. Alara stood when the door opened. 6 guards entered, led by a Voss captain carrying the king's seal. Ilara Draven, he said, by order of Alpha King Kale, you are under arrest for suspected treason against Blackmoor. Ilara looked at the seal, then at the men around her. Whatever hope remained in her face disappeared without a sound. Far beyond the walls, beneath a moonless sky, the first Silvercrest cavalry reached the outer valley. And at the front of the column, King Aldrich rode with one hand closed around the other half of a broken silver crest. The iron doors beneath Blackmoor closed behind Alara with a sound so final that even the guards avoided meeting her eyes. She had been stripped of the silver mantle. The marriage ring was already gone, and now even her name seemed to have been reduced to an accusation stamped beneath Kael's seal. The dungeon was colder than the eastern tower, cut deep into the black stone beneath the palace, where damp crept through the walls and every breath tasted of rust. Ilara pressed one hand against her abdomen, as another cramp tightened through her body, sharper than before, and for the first time fear rose above heartbreak. Kael's betrayal had wounded her pride. Seraphine's theft had humiliated her before the court, but the child inside her changed the meaning of every danger. She could endure chains. She could endure being called traitor. What she could not endure was allowing the people hunting her to reach the life that had not yet opened its eyes. Above the dungeon, Garrick moved quickly, because dawn was approaching, and with it the one enemy he could not control, time. He summoned only the counselors most dependent on House Voss, presented forged reports claiming Alara had contacted Silvercrest weeks before the feast, and framed her messenger as proof of a coordinated betrayal. Seraphine sat beside him wearing Alara's moonstone clasp, but triumph no longer softened her expression. She had seen fear in her father for the first time, and that frightened her more than any army. "If she is what I think she is," Seraphine said when the room emptied, "why did you let her marry Kael?" Garrick slammed the council table with his palm. "Because she was supposed to remain nameless." His voice dropped. "A woman without proof is a rumor. A woman with blood, a seal, and a northern king behind her becomes a war." Seraphine stared at him. "You knew her mother." Garrick's silence confirmed more than words would have. She stepped closer. "What did you do?" He looked toward the shuttered windows, as if 22 years could still walk through them. "I did what men do when kingdoms refuse to obey." Seraphine's face changed, but not from horror. She was calculating. "Then we cannot let her speak." Garrick finally looked at his daughter, and in that moment the difference between them disappeared. "Now you understand." In another wing of the palace, Rowan forced open the locked door of an abandoned military storeroom after following a trail of blood beneath the threshold. Mara was inside, wrists bound, face bruised, one eye nearly swollen shut. She had been beaten, but the moment Rowan cut the rope, she grabbed his sleeve and whispered. The vial was Voss. The feast was staged. Rowan crouched beside her. "Can you prove it?" Mara pulled a torn piece of wax from inside her sleeve, where she had hidden it before being captured. Seraphine told the wine steward which goblet to bring. Garrick's men planted the poison in the Luna's room. I heard them arguing because one of them wanted more money. Rowan's jaw tightened. "And the physician?" Mara swallowed hard. "There was another order, a draft for Lady Alara. Something to end a pregnancy." For several seconds Rowan said nothing. Then his expression hardened in a way Mara had never seen. Pregnancy? Mara realized she had revealed too much, but there was no time left to protect secrets gently. "The Luna is with child." Rowan rose so abruptly the stool overturned behind him. "Kael knows?" Mara's silence was answer enough. Maelor found Rowan minutes later. The old elder listened without interrupting, then reached beneath his robe and produced a folded packet of documents that had yellowed with age. "I was hoping I would die before needing these," he said. Rowan looked at him. "That is no longer your choice." Maelor's eyes closed briefly. "No, it is hers." They descended toward the dungeon through an old corridor known only to senior members of the court. When Maelor entered Alara's cell, she was sitting against the wall, pale but upright. Rowan stopped when he saw the blood on her wrist and the way her hand remained protectively over her stomach. Something like shame flickered across his face, though none of this had been his doing. Maelor knelt in front of Alara and placed the old documents between them. "You asked why your father never came." Alara's eyes lifted. "Tell me the truth." Maelor did. 22 years earlier, King Aldrich of Silvercrest had rejected a military pact that would have placed Blackmoor troops along the northern trade roads. Garrick, then a rising commander desperate to make his house indispensable, had helped organize a faction that planned to force the alliance by controlling the royal succession. Queen Lysandra discovered correspondence proving the conspiracy and fled before they could seize her infant daughter. Garrick's men pursued her across 2 borders. She escaped, but Garrick sent false reports, claiming both mother and child had died crossing the Winter Mountains. Aldrich never believed them. For years he sent scouts, healers, merchants, priests, even mercenaries disguised as caravan guards to search for Lysandra and the child. Letters were sent into Blackmoor under secret seals. None reached their destination. Ilara listened without moving, but tears slowly filled her eyes. "He looked for me?" Her voice barely held. Maelor nodded. "Every year." Ilara looked down, and the grief that passed over her face was quieter than anything Rowan had witnessed in battle. All her life she had carried an invisible wound shaped like abandonment. She had imagined a father who forgot her, a family that chose a kingdom over a child, and now she learned that the distance had been manufactured by a man who still walked freely through the same palace. "My mother died believing he had stopped searching," she whispered. Maelor's face tightened. "No, Garrick made sure both of you believed that." Rowan placed Mara's wax fragment beside the papers, and this proves House Voss staged the poisoning. He added a second item, a small bottle taken from the physician's quarters. "This is the draft sent to you yesterday." Alara stared at it. Rowan's voice dropped. "Mara says it was meant to end the pregnancy." Alara closed her eyes once, briefly, as if containing something enormous. When she opened them, fear had become anger. "Then Seraphine knows." Rowan nodded. "And if Garrick knows Silvercrest is near, they may try to finish this before dawn." As if summoned by the warning, footsteps exploded in the corridor outside. The first guard never reached the cell door. A blade slid through the gap between his ribs, and he fell without a cry. A second man rushed in wearing Blackmoor armor, but Rowan saw immediately that he carried no palace insignia. The assassin lunged for Alara. Rowan intercepted him, steel crashing against steel inside the narrow cell. Alara backed against the wall, one hand protecting her abdomen while the other searched desperately for anything she could use. The assassin kicked Rowan into the bars and turned toward her. Alara seized the iron water cup and struck him across the temple. He staggered but did not fall. His knife sliced across her forearm when she raised it to defend herself, opening a bright line of blood. Before he could strike again, Rowan drove his sword through the man's back. The assassin collapsed at Alara's feet. Rowan dragged the body into the torchlight and searched it. Inside the man's boot, he found a silver coin stamped with the crest of House Voss. Beneath the breastplate was an execution order bearing Kael's signature. Rowan stared at it. "This seal is wrong." Maelor leaned closer. "Forged." Alara looked at the paper for several long seconds, then said, "It no longer matters whether this one was forged. He signed enough real orders to put me here." Those words reached Kael less than an hour later. Rowan stormed into the royal chamber without waiting to be announced and threw the assassin's coin, the poison vial, Mara's wax fragment, and the forged order across the table. Kael read everything in silence. His face changed first at the Voss seal, then again when Rowan told him about Mara, but the final blow came when he mentioned the pregnancy. Kael went still. "What did you say?" Rowan did not soften it. "Alara is carrying your child." The room seemed to contract around him. Kael remembered the parchment inside her silver gown. He remembered her hand moving over her abdomen in the great hall. He remembered the moment she had flinched when the guards twisted her wrist, and he had chosen not to ask why. "How long?" "Nearly 2 months." Kael turned away, one hand gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, everything Seraphine had done became secondary to what he himself had done. Alara had stood before him carrying the child he had wanted for 3 years, and he had humiliated her publicly, stripped her title, taken another woman into their chamber, and signed the order that put her in a dungeon. "Bring her to me," he said. Rowan's expression hardened. "She is no longer where you left her." Before Kael could answer, the palace bells began ringing. Not celebration bells. War bells. Garrick had already moved his private troops into the inner courtyard, claiming Silvercrest forces had crossed the northern boundary and that Alara's treason was confirmed. By the time Kael reached the council hall, armed Voss soldiers lined both sides of the chamber. Garrick stood beside the throne as if he had always belonged there. "You hid the army from me," Kael said. "I prevented panic. You forged an execution order." Garrick did not blink. "Then arrest me after you save your kingdom." The doors opened. Ilara was brought in under guard. Her left sleeve was dark with blood from the assassin's knife, but she walked without lowering her head. Kael's gaze dropped instinctively toward her stomach. Alara saw it. She understood immediately that someone had told him. For one heartbeat, something raw passed between them. Then, Garrick destroyed it. "Silvercrest is approaching under war banners," he announced to the council. "The accused sent them a royal seal. If we release her now, Blackmoor kneels to foreign intimidation." Several elders shouted in agreement. Others remained silent. Kale knew the evidence against Alara was collapsing, but he also knew that thousands of soldiers might already be outside the walls. He faced a final choice: protect the woman he had already failed twice, or preserve the image of control before a frightened court. "Remove the charges," Rowan said from behind him. "Now," Garrick countered immediately, "and announce to 20,000 northern soldiers that Blackmoor trembles whenever they threaten us." Kale looked at Alara. She did not beg. That somehow made the decision worse. "Take her to the judgment platform," Kale ordered at last. "No execution until I complete the investigation." Alara's face changed. Not fear. Recognition. This was the moment she finally understood that even with poison, forged orders, missing witnesses, and blood on her arm, Kale still cared more about appearing weak than about choosing her openly. "You still need more proof," she said quietly. Kale took one step toward her. "Alara." She turned away before he could finish. The judgment platform stood outside the great hall beneath the eastern tower, where traitors were traditionally sentenced at dawn. Word spread through the palace faster than fire. Nobles crowded the balconies. Soldiers filled the courtyard. Seraphine appeared above them wearing Alara's Luna mantle, the moonstone clasp gleaming at her throat. Alara was led to the center of the platform. The executioner stood beside the black block with his sword lowered, waiting for an order that Kale had insisted would not come. But Alara looked at the blade and knew better than anyone how easily kings broke promises when fear was watching. Then the first horn sounded beyond the walls. Deep. Long. Foreign. Every wolf in the courtyard went silent. A second horn answered, then a third. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath thousands of approaching hooves. A guard ran onto the battlement and stared toward the northern valley, his face drained of color. "Silvercrest," another soldier shouted from the tower. "They've surrounded the outer wall." Kale rushed up the steps to the battlement. Garrick followed, but this time the older man's confidence was gone. Below Blackmoor, the entire northern valley had disappeared beneath silver banners. Ranks of armored cavalry stretched from one ridge to the other. Siege engines rolled into position behind them. At the center of the formation rode an old king beneath the crowned wolf standard of Silvercrest. King Aldrich raised one hand. The army stopped as one. Then he lifted half of a broken silver crest high enough for the walls of Blackmoor to see. His voice carried across the valley. "Return my daughter alive before the sun clears those mountains." A cold wind moved through the courtyard. On the judgment platform below, Alara closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, the father she had believed abandoned her was standing close enough to burn a kingdom down for her. The valley below Blackmoor looked less like an army encampment than the edge of a silver sea, because every ridge, every frozen field, and every road leading north had disappeared beneath the banners of Silvercrest, while the first pale light of dawn caught on spearheads and armor until the entire horizon seemed to burn. King Aldrich remained mounted at the center of that vast formation, his raised hand still holding half of the broken royal crest, and no soldier behind him moved until Blackmoor answered. On the judgment platform above, Alara stood with blood drying along her forearm and iron restraints around her wrists, while Seraphine watched from the balcony wearing the stolen Luna mantle, and Kale remained between them, trapped beneath the weight of a decision he had already made too many times. The silence became unbearable before Aldrich finally spoke again, his voice carrying across the walls with the force of something older than anger. "I will ask once more, and then I will stop asking. Bring me my daughter alive." Kale descended from the battlement without waiting for Garrick's counsel, but Garrick followed him with the desperate fury of a man watching 20 years of deception collapse in a single sunrise. "If you open those gates now, you surrender Blackmoor," he warned. Kale turned so sharply that several guards stepped back. "If I keep that platform after everything I have just learned, I surrender something worse." Garrick's face tightened, but Kale no longer looked at him as a trusted commander. He looked at him as a threat. "Remove Alara's restraints." The order spread through the courtyard, and for the first time that morning the balance of power shifted visibly. Some soldiers obeyed Kale at once, while men wearing the Voss crest hesitated, glancing toward Garrick for direction. That hesitation told every elder present that House Voss had built a loyalty network inside the king's own walls. Rowan reached Alara first. He unlocked the iron around her wrists carefully, his expression darkening when he saw the raw skin underneath. Kale approached from behind, but Alara did not turn toward him. "I am opening the gate," he said, trying to keep his voice controlled. "You should have opened your eyes before you opened the gate," she answered, not loudly, but every word landed harder than a shout because there was no desperation left in her tone. Kael flinched, yet before he could respond, another cramp seized Alara low in the abdomen. She caught the edge of the platform and forced herself to remain standing. Rowan noticed immediately. Kael noticed too, and this time fear replaced pride in his face. "Call the physician." Alara shook her head. "No Voss physician comes near me again." The accusation carried through the courtyard, and several nobles shifted uneasily as Seraphine's hand rose instinctively toward the moonstone clasp at her throat. When the gates finally opened, King Aldrich did not send soldiers storming through them. He rode forward alone at first, accompanied only by 4 royal guards and an elderly standard-bearer carrying the crowned wolf banner. That restraint terrified Blackmoor more than an attack might have, because it showed that Aldrich did not need chaos to prove his power. He crossed the stone bridge beneath hundreds of drawn bows without looking left or right, and the moment his horse entered the courtyard, his eyes found Alara. Everything in his face changed. The hard expression of a king disappeared beneath something raw and stunned, because the woman standing bloodied beneath Blackmoor's judgment tower had the same dark eyes, the same tilt of the chin, and the same stubborn refusal to lower her head that Queen Lysandra had carried 22 years earlier. Aldrich dismounted before anyone announced him, took 3 slow steps forward, and then stopped as though afraid that one more movement might make her vanish. Alara looked at him with a grief, so old it no longer knew whether to become anger or hope. Aldrich raised the broken half of the crest in his hand. "Your mother had the other half." Alara reached inside the torn fold of her gown and removed the silver piece she had recovered from Lysandra's box. A tremor passed through Aldrich's face when he saw it. Maelor stepped forward from the edge of the council and asked permission to witness the joining. No one objected. The 2 pieces were placed together on a stone table before the gathered court, and when the edges met, a hidden groove inside the metal formed the full seal of the Silvercrest royal line, including a miniature inscription visible only when both halves were joined. Maelor read it aloud, and the courtyard went completely still. The words named Lysandra's firstborn daughter as legitimate heir to the northern crown. Seraphine's face drained of color. Garrick looked as though someone had struck him. Aldrich did not look at either of them. He faced the entire Blackmoor court and declared that Alara was not a nameless woman raised without a house, not an orphan without allies, and not a disposable Luna whom anyone could strip of dignity when convenient. She was Princess Alara Silvercrest, daughter of Queen Lysandra, daughter of the Northern Crown, and the sole living heir recognized under Silvercrest succession law. One by one, elders who had mocked her lineage lowered their heads. Several nobles dropped to one knee. Others followed, because remaining upright suddenly looked like defiance against an army waiting outside the walls. Alara watched them with a strange calm. Only hours earlier, those same people had watched Kael tear the moonstone clasp from her clothing without protest. Now they knelt because a stronger kingdom had spoken her name. Kael stood among them and understood the cruelty of the contrast better than anyone. Alara had not become valuable because Aldrich arrived. She had always possessed the same intelligence, the same loyalty, the same courage that had stood beside him for 3 years. The only thing that changed was that power had finally made other people respect what he should have recognized without needing proof. That realization cut deeper than humiliation, because no enemy had taken Alara from him. He had taught her that love without trust could become another form of abandonment. Alara could have demanded Seraphine's arrest immediately, but she did something more dangerous. She demanded evidence. "Bring Mara here," she said. "Bring every item Rowan recovered, every bottle, every seal, every report Garrick submitted, and every physician who treated Seraphine after the feast." Aldrich glanced at her, and pride briefly softened his expression. Kael gave the order without argument. Mara was carried into the courtyard minutes later, bruised but conscious, and when she saw Alara standing beside King Aldrich instead of beneath the execution platform, relief broke across her face. She testified that Seraphine had instructed the steward which goblet to use, that Voss men had planted the poison vial, and that she had been seized after discovering the wax seal connecting the evidence to Garrick's stores. Rowan then placed the moonroot draft on the stone table, followed by the assassin's silver coin and the forged execution order. Maelor added the old diplomatic records, including letters from Silvercrest that had never reached Lysandra. Garrick's control finally cracked. "Ancient paper and the testimony of servants mean nothing against military necessity," he snapped. Aldrich turned toward him with terrifying calm. "You hunted my wife." Garrick did not answer. "You told me she died in the mountains. Still no answer. You intercepted my letters to my child. Garrick's silence became confession. Seraphine saw her father losing and made one last desperate move. She stepped forward, clutching the Luna mantle around herself, as if fabric could still protect her. Whatever my father did 20 years ago has nothing to do with Kale and me, she said, then placed one hand dramatically over her abdomen. I am carrying the Alpha King's child. Shock tore through the courtyard. Kale stared at her. Ilara's expression did not change, but Garrick immediately seized the opportunity and declared that Blackmoor's future heir could not be handed over to foreign influence. Kale ordered the royal physician forward. The examination did not take long. The physician emerged pale and refused to meet Seraphine's eyes. There is no pregnancy. The words struck the court like another horn blast. Seraphine's face hardened. She accused the physician of lying, but Rowan produced payment records found in a Voss account showing that another healer had been bribed to prepare false pregnancy documents if needed. Seraphine's final shield shattered in front of everyone she had tried to impress. Then Ilara doubled over. The pain came so suddenly that she nearly collapsed before Aldrich caught one arm and Rowan caught the other. Kale moved toward her, but Ilara instinctively pulled away from him, and that movement hurt him more than any accusation could have. The midwife was summoned immediately. She knelt beside Ilara, checked her pulse, then looked up with alarm. She needs rest. The child is under strain. The courtyard fell silent again. Kale stopped breathing for a moment. The midwife, realizing there was no longer any reason to conceal the truth, continued. The princess is nearly 8 weeks pregnant. Kale looked at Ilara as if the world had shifted beneath him. Every piece of the previous night returned at once. The parchment in her gown, her hand over her stomach, the pain she had tried to hide when the guards twisted her wrist, the words she had spoken before he chose Seraphine. He had wanted an heir so badly that he allowed the absence of one to poison his marriage, and the entire time the child had already existed. The physician examined the moonroot draft and confirmed that the concentration could have caused a miscarriage, severe bleeding, or death if Ilara had swallowed enough. The effect on the court was immediate. This was no longer a matter of jealousy, ambition, or stolen titles. Someone had attempted to kill the unborn child of the Alpha King and the heir of Silvercrest. Seraphine stepped backward. Ilara looked directly at her. You knew. Seraphine's composure finally shattered. You were never supposed to matter this much. That sentence condemned her more completely than denial ever could. Garrick understood there was no path left through law. He raised one hand. Every Voss soldier in the courtyard drew steel. The first attack came from behind the council benches. A blade flashed toward Aldrich, another toward Ilara, and within seconds the great courtyard exploded into violence. Rowan drove himself between Ilara and the nearest attacker, while Kale seized a fallen sword and fought toward her from the opposite side. Garrick shouted that Silvercrest had staged a coup, hoping confusion would split the Blackmoor guard, but too much truth had already been exposed. Many soldiers wearing Blackmoor colors turned on the Voss men instead. Seraphine tried to flee. Garrick grabbed her by the arm. She stared at him in disbelief. Father, let go. You are still useful. For the first time in her life, Seraphine understood that she had never been his heir, his pride, or even truly his daughter, in the way she imagined. She had been leverage. Garrick dragged her through the western archway with the remnants of his private guard and retreated toward the old fortress beyond the inner wall. By the time Kale reached the gate, they were already gone. Silvercrest commanders immediately called for a full assault. Aldrich agreed. Ilara stopped them. She stood pale and trembling beside the stone table, one hand pressed protectively over her child, but her voice carried clearly enough for both armies to hear. No. Aldrich turned toward her. Ilara looked at the walls of Blackmoor, at the servants, soldiers, stable boys, healers, and families who would die if 2 kingdoms turned one man's crime into a war. Garrick does not get to choose how many innocent people pay for what he did. Aldrich studied her for a long moment. Then he removed the silver command insignia from his cloak and placed it in her hand. Then you choose. Kale watched as officers from Silvercrest and Blackmoor lowered their heads before Ilara. Only hours earlier she had stood bound beneath a blade waiting for him to decide whether she deserved mercy. Now 2 armies waited for her to decide what justice would look like. For the first time since the Blood Moon Feast, Ilara did not look like a woman trying to survive someone else's choice. She looked like the person who would make the next one. Ilara did not order Silvercrest to storm the western fortress, because she understood that Garrick's last hope was to force her into the kind of bloody decision he could later use to justify everything he had done. Instead, she surrounded the old stronghold with both Blackmoor and Silvercrest soldiers, leaving one narrow road open for surrender, then sent a message inside promising mercy to every common soldier who laid down his weapon before sunrise. The order spread quickly through the fortress, and by midnight men who had served House Voss for years began lowering their swords because loyalty to Garrick had never been worth dying for. KL watched from the ridge as Ilara dismantled the rebellion without sacrificing hundreds of lives, and every calm command she gave reminded him that the woman he had treated as politically weak possessed more restraint, courage, and authority than many kings he had known. He had once mistaken gentleness for fragility, and now an entire battlefield was proving how catastrophically wrong he had been. Inside the fortress, Garrick's control finally began to collapse. Seraphine stood before him with one wrist bruised from where he had dragged her through the palace, and for the first time she was looking at her father without admiration. "You said we would rule Blackmoor," she told him, her voice low and raw. Garrick barely glanced at her. "We still can, if you stop behaving like a frightened girl." He pushed a dagger into her hand and pointed toward the narrow passage that led to the outer gate. "Ilara will come when she believes the men are surrendering. You will get close enough to finish what should have been finished before the feast." Seraphine stared at the blade, then at him. "You want me to murder a pregnant woman in front of 2 armies?" Garrick's expression did not change. "I want you to save what remains of our house." That was the moment Seraphine finally understood the truth that Ilara had been forced to understand much earlier. Ambition did not love anyone, not even the people who fed it. Garrick had never protected his daughter because he valued her life. He had protected her because she was useful. Seraphine's pride had allowed her to ignore that difference for years, but standing inside a failing fortress with a knife pressed into her palm, she could no longer pretend. "If I fail, you will leave me here," she said. Garrick gave her the smallest look of irritation. He did not need to answer. Seraphine let the dagger fall to the floor. By the time the western gate opened, Garrick had lost nearly half his men. Ilara entered only after Rowan confirmed that the main courtyard had been secured. Aldrich wanted her to remain behind the front line, and Kale insisted on accompanying her, but Ilara refused to hide from the confrontation that had shaped her entire life. She walked into the fortress wearing neither the Blackmoor Luna mantle nor Silvercrest ceremonial robes, only a dark traveling cloak over the simple dress the midwife had chosen to protect her from the cold. That choice unsettled the remaining Voss soldiers more than a crown would have. She did not need symbols anymore. Her name alone carried more weight than the garment Seraphine had stolen. Garrick was waiting in the inner hall with a sword at Seraphine's throat. The sight stopped everyone. Seraphine's face had lost all traces of triumph. Her hair hung loose, the moonstone clasp was gone, and the crimson gown that had looked victorious during the Blood Moon feast was torn at the shoulder. Garrick pressed the blade closer. One step and she dies. Ilara looked at Seraphine. For several long seconds neither woman spoke. Then Seraphine gave a broken laugh. "Funny, isn't it? I spent months trying to take your place, and this is where it brought me." Ilara's expression remained hard. "You knew about my child." Seraphine closed her eyes. That silence was enough. Garrick tightened his grip, but Seraphine suddenly drove her heel backward into his knee. The movement was clumsy, desperate, but it created the opening Rowan needed. Garrick staggered. Rowan crossed the distance in seconds, struck the sword from his hand, and forced him to the floor beneath the weight of 3 guards. Garrick fought like a trapped animal until Kyle himself seized him by the collar and slammed him against the stone. For one dangerous moment, Kale looked ready to kill him. Ilara stopped him. "Do not give him the mercy of dying before everyone hears what he did." Kale released Garrick. That was the first time he obeyed Ilara without trying to control the outcome. The trial began the next day in the same great hall where Ilara had been stripped of her title. Nothing about the location was accidental. Aldrich wanted Silvercrest justice, the Blackmoor elders wanted political stability, and Kale wanted Garrick condemned as quickly as possible, but Ilara insisted that every charge be spoken publicly and every witness be heard. She would not allow secrecy to protect anyone again. Mara testified first. She described Seraphine's instructions during the Blood Moon feast, the planted poison, the Voss wax seal, and the men who captured her when she found the evidence. Rowan followed with the assassin's coin, the forged execution order, and the Moonroot draft. Maelor then presented the old letters Garrick had intercepted from Silvercrest, including one written by Aldrich 21 years earlier, promising Queen Lysandra that he would never stop searching for her or their daughter. When the letter was read aloud, Ilara lowered her eyes. Aldrich did not. He watched Garrick with a hatred so controlled it frightened the room more than shouting would have. Then Seraphine was called. She stood in the center of the hall without jewelry, without the Luna mantle, and without the confidence that had once made her seem untouchable. Garrick refused to look at her. Seraphine admitted that the false poisoning had been her idea. She admitted that she had deliberately encouraged Kyle's resentment toward Ilara, knowing that pressure over the missing heir had become the fracture in their marriage. She admitted that she had ordered the physician to prepare a pregnancy-ending draft after suspecting Ilara's condition. She admitted that she had wanted the humiliation at the feast because simply removing Ilara was not enough. She wanted Ilara to watch Kale choose someone else. A murmur of disgust moved through the hall. Seraphine's voice shook only once. I wanted her to lose everything in one night. Ilara looked directly at her. You almost took my child. Seraphine nodded. There was no apology large enough for that, and both women knew it. Garrick's sentence came first. He was stripped of title, lands, military rank, and family authority. Every property held by House Voss under military privilege was returned to the villages from which it had been taken. He was then transferred into Silvercrest custody to face charges for the conspiracy against Queen Lysandra, falsification of royal records, attempted murder, and treason against 2 crowns. Seraphine's punishment was different. She lost her inheritance, her family name in all court records, and any claim to position in Blackmoor. She was exiled from both kingdoms and forbidden to hold rank under any allied house. Ilara refused calls for execution, not because Seraphine deserved kindness, but because death would end the consequences too quickly. Seraphine would live, knowing that the throne she tried to steal had cost her, her name, her family, and every privilege she had believed permanent. Then the elders turned toward Kale. The hall became quieter than it had been for Garrick's sentence. The oldest member of the council carried forward a black-bound volume containing the sacred Luna Covenant, a law older than House Draven itself. He read aloud the clauses Kale had broken. A lawful Luna could not be publicly stripped of rank without judgment. Her ceremonial authority could not be transferred to another woman, while accusations remained unproven, and no Alpha King could place his bonded Luna on a traitor's platform without completed evidence. Kale already knew where the judgment was going. The elder continued. By breaking the covenant before the entire court, Kale had forfeited the automatic right to determine the dynastic status of any child born to Ilara while the bond remained legally disputed. The child could be acknowledged as Draven only if Ilara chose it. Otherwise, under Silvercrest law, the baby could remain entirely within her maternal line. The irony cut through Kale more deeply than any sword wound. He had allowed fear over an heir to destroy his marriage. Now, the heir existed, and he no longer possessed the right to claim that child as the future of Blackmoor. Kale rose from the throne. Then, before the entire court, he removed his crown. He walked down the steps until he stood before Ilara, and instead of speaking as a king, he lowered himself to one knee. The hall watched in absolute silence. Seraphine lied to me, Kale said, and Garrick manipulated my court, but neither of them forced my hand when I tore your clasp away. Neither of them forced me to ignore your pain. Neither of them forced me to sign the order that put you in chains. I chose pride every time trust demanded courage, and I nearly lost you and our child because I preferred looking strong to being worthy of you. He placed the moonstone clasp on the floor between them. I cannot ask you to forget what I did. Ilara looked down at the silver wolf emblem that had once meant everything to her. Then she stepped around it. What I needed was never this, she said. I needed you to believe me before an army proved I deserved to be believed. Kale lowered his head. There was nothing he could say that would make the sentence less true. Ilara returned to Silvercrest 3 days later. Aldrich did not rush her into public ceremony, but when her strength returned and the physicians confirmed that the child was safe, he formally named her Crown Heir before the Northern Council. The announcement transformed politics across both kingdoms. Houses that had once treated her as a temporary Luna now sent ambassadors requesting her favor. Ilara accepted none of their praise without remembering how quickly those same people had remained silent when she stood in chains. Kale stayed in Blackmoor. He dismissed the Voss-controlled commanders, restored lands taken under Garrick's military rule, compensated Mara and her family, and forced the council to adopt new limits on unilateral royal punishment. None of these acts brought Ilara back, and Kale eventually understood that they were not supposed to. Reform was not a gift to win forgiveness. It was the minimum debt owed after failure. Months later, Ilara gave birth to a healthy child beneath the silver banners of her father's kingdom. Kael was not in the room. He was not even inside Silvercrest when the child was born. He learned of the birth from a sealed royal message that contained only 3 lines confirming that mother and baby had survived. Weeks later, he came north alone. No army escorted him. No crown rested on his head. He carried no treaty, no jewels, and no demand. Aldrich nearly refused him entry. Ilara made the decision herself. Kael was brought into a quiet chamber overlooking the northern gardens, where Ilara sat beside the window with the child sleeping against her chest. When Kael saw them, every defense he had built over the previous months disappeared. He did not reach for the baby until Ilara gave permission. "You may hold your child," she told him. The words were kinder than he deserved and colder than he hoped. Kael accepted the infant with trembling hands. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King understood what it meant to possess absolutely no power over something he desperately loved. Maelor arrived later that evening with one final truth. He showed Ilara records proving that Aldrich had stationed quiet protectors near her for years, never close enough to expose her identity, but always near enough to intervene if Garrick's hunters found her. Some of the healers, caravan guards, and old travelers Ilara remembered from childhood had not been strangers at all. Aldrich had never stopped looking. He had never stopped protecting her. The realization broke something open inside Ilara, that betrayal had nearly sealed shut forever. She had spent most of her life believing she had been abandoned by the father she could not remember, only to discover that the man who lost her had spent decades searching, while the husband who actually had her beside him had thrown her away in a single night. During the Silvercrest succession ceremony, Kael stood below the royal platform without a crown. Ilara stood beside Aldrich with her child in her arms, while nobles from across the north lowered their heads before her. The image was the exact reverse of the Blood Moon feast. Once, Ilara had stood below Kael, while Seraphine wore her mantle. Now Kael stood below Ilara, while an entire kingdom recognized the woman he had failed to recognize when it mattered most. Before leaving, Kael placed the moonstone clasp on the stone step beneath the throne. Ilara looked at it once. Then she walked past it. She did not promise never to forgive him, because forgiveness was hers to decide when and if it ever became possible. She did not promise to return, because love could not be restored by regret alone. Kael watched her carry their child into the light beyond the great doors, and finally understood the true cost of one night. A king could rebuild a court, replace an army, restore a damaged throne, and recover land lost in war. What he could not command back into existence was the trust of the woman he had publicly destroyed when she needed him most. And if this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments whether Ilara should ever give Kael another chance, or whether some betrayals deserve a door that never fully opens again, and subscribe if you want more stories where power, love, and betrayal always come with a price.